As you have probably heard, in May 2021, Amazon struck a deal to buy film studio MGM for a reported $8.45 billion. Amazon has said that they see a gold mine in buying the legendary company. How did we get here? In this video, I'll discuss the founding of MGM, its golden era, its years of turmoil, and where it is today. Welcome to Real Hollywoodland, where we delve into the stars and stories of old Hollywood. Before we get started, please be sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel if you want more old Hollywood related videos. Okay, enough of that, let's dive in. Let's go back to where it all started. In the early 1900s, Marcus Loew owned a chain of about 150 theaters, mostly in New York, the Northeast, and the Deep South. In 1919, he bought Metro Pictures to keep his theaters supplied with new films. The problem was that the pictures that Metro put out weren't that great. He knew he had the right idea in owning a studio, so in hopes of getting better movies, he then bought Goldwyn Pictures in 1924, owned by Samuel Goldwyn. Now, owning two studios, Loew knew he needed someone out in California to keep an eye on things. His solution was to buy Louis B. Mayer Pictures and have Mayer run the operation. The merger was complete April 18, 1924, and the newly merged studio was renamed Metro Goldwyn Mayer. LB would run the day-to-day operations of the studio, and 24-year-old boy genius Irving Thalberg would be head of production. Even though his name was still on the company, Samuel Goldwyn was not involved with the management or the production at the newly formed MGM. Once created, the studio was off to the races, literally, and made more than 100 feature films during its first 2 years, the most extravagant of those being Ben-Hur. Ironically, Ben-Hur brackets the golden age for MGM, with the original production in 1924 and then the remaking of the classic in 1959. Here's what happened in between. L.B. Mayer became an incredibly influential man in Hollywood, even founding the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences and the Academy Awards. I have a whole video about the history of the Oscars, so I'll link it up in the cards, so be sure and check that one out. Anyway, MGM was like its own city, and LB was the king of that city, or the lion in this case. When in peak production, MGM had around 6,000 employees on the lot. The studio had its own police force, dentists, chiropractor, doctors, and even an in-house electrical plant. During the golden age, MGM would be known for being the most glamorous of the big five Hollywood studios, and for the creation of the star system, which the other studios would come to mimic. Their model back then was that they had more stars than were in the heavens. At its height, MGM had 33 actors designated as stars, 72 as featured players, and 26 directors under contract. The star system was basically a way of creating, promoting, and then usually exploiting stars. Starlets in those days would sign to the studio and often be given a new name, backstory, image, and be put into the public relations machine to become stars. For example, when Lucille Lasser arrived at MGM, she was told that her name sounded fake and that her last name sounded like sewer. So the publicity department held a contest called Name the Star in Movie Weekly for readers to pick a new name for the starlet. The winning name ended up being Joan Arden, however another actress already had that name, so instead her name became Joan Crawford, and you've probably heard of her.
It was such a joy to be at MGM. Everything was first class, top drawer. The thing that I loved about it, they had a press department there of 100 people that did nothing morning, noon, and night except figure out stories to get their stars or their starlets pictures in fan magazines. And one of the things that I loved about MGM was that if they sent a star or a starlet to a premiere, if they didn't have a beautiful dress, the studio furnished it. If they didn't have a limo, the studio furnished it. If they didn't have an escort, the studio furnished it. If they didn't have a fur coat, or they got it. They got everything they needed to make the appearance of glamour. When we were told at MGM, when you go to the grocery store, don't go out with your hair in curlers. Don't go out looking sloppy. Look nice, because at the grocery store will be your fans. And we were trained like that. We were petted and combed like a French poodle. Everybody had to be their idea of what they wanted you to look like. One of the things that I remember so clearly, nobody, including Greer Garson and Clark Gable, or Ava Gardner or Lana Turner, if you don't sing and dance, you couldn't be under contract.
The star system focused on image above all else and gave their starlets acting, voice, and dance lessons. When a performer wasn't working in a picture, they were expected to be exercising and attending dance, music, and speech classes. On top of all of that, school-age contract players were required to go to the one-room schoolhouse on the lot known as the Little Red Schoolhouse.
In the schoolroom, we went to school. There was Elizabeth Taylor, and we did, believe it or not, and Lana Turner, and Mickey Rooney, and Freddie Bartholomew, and me, and Deanna Durbin.
Even when not behind the studio gates, women were supposed to always look and act like ladies, and men were expected to be gentlemen. Most of the talent even had morality clauses in their contract that allowed the studio to terminate their contract if they did anything that violated public conventions or morals. Howard Strickland was head of publicity at the studio, and his team worked around the clock to conceal aspects of stars that were seen at the time to be unfavorable, such as alcoholism, suicide attempts, homosexuality, and even unflattering pictures.
I went to an opening of another performer, and they took advantage of some pictures that were made by the cabaret photographer. There was one of the pictures, it looked like something else, and they began to be the early trashy headline with Lena Horne. I called Strickland, Howard Strickland at MGM, told him what had happened, and they sat on it. It was stopped.
Along with the protection provided by the studio, part of being under contract was having all aspects of your life monitored and controlled by the studio. For example, under pressure from the studio, Judy Garland was forced into terminating her pregnancy after she became pregnant while married to her first husband, David Rose. Being a young mother, although she was married, did not fit into the image that the studio wanted to project for her. A few years later, the studio approved of her marriage to MGM director Vicente Minnelli, and the studio head L.B. Mayer even gave her away at the wedding. An actress and a director falling in love while making a movie together, that was perfect for studio publicity. The studio also approved when they welcomed their daughter Liza the following year. But if the morality clause wasn't enough, MGM had its own private police force. The police force had 50 officers, 4 captains, 2 plainclothes officers, an inspector, and a chief. The MGM force was actually larger than the local Culver City police force. The MGM officers were required to recognize each contract player on site and had to salute each star when seeing them. Not only did the police protect the talent from the public, but the talent from their own self-destruction as well. Whenever there was an incident, Whitey Hendry, chief of MGM police, would beat the police to the scene, and the publicity department would keep the story out of the press. To keep this operation going, the studio had paid informants in the surrounding area police forces. In Ava Gardner's autobiography, Ava Gardner, The Secret Conversations, written with Peter Evans, she remembers how one night while dating Howard Hughes, he took a swipe at her jaw and she returned the favor by hitting him with an onyx ashtray. There was blood everywhere and she thought she may have killed him. She called the studio and the mess was immediately cleaned up and no one was the wiser. Luckily, Howard did not in fact die from the blow and Ava's career didn't die from a scandal. It's even rumored that Clark Gable killed a man while driving drunk one night and that the studio was able to keep it all under wraps, but that's just a rumor. Irving Thalberg would die at the age of 37 in 1936, and with his death, Mayer became the head of production, studio chief, and the first $1 million executive in American history. A couple of years later, in 1938, Mayer was talked into buying the rights to The Wonderful Wizard of Oz from Sam Goldwyn for $75,000. Although The Wizard of Oz was a critical hit when it came out the following year, it didn't actually turn a profit until about 20 years later when it began being shown on television in the mid-1950s. With other extravagant productions like Gone with the Wind in 1939, starring Vivien Leigh and Clark Gable, and produced by Mayer's son-in-law David O. Selznick, MGM continued its reputation for sophisticated and polished films. MGM Pictures gave audiences a way to escape the realities of life and the harshness of the Great Depression. They often portrayed an aspirational reality, such as the luxuries of Park Avenue or the lives of the idle rich. However, when the Great Depression hit, the studio itself was not immune from the financial strain and began to economize by reusing sets, costumes, and furnishings. This practice would continue for years as the studio struggled to remain profitable.
Then I suggest you start walking.
In 1942, Mayer decided to shake things up and release his highest paid stars from their contracts: Joan Crawford, Norma Shearer, Greta Garbo, Myrna Loy, and Jeanette MacDonald. Joan would move to Warner Brothers, where she would earn an Oscar in 1945's Mildred Pierce, while Shearer and Garbo never made films again. Mayer ended up hiring Loy and McDonald back to the studio a few years later. The studio kept making hits under Mayer's leadership. 1944 saw hits such as Meet Me in St. Louis, starring Judy Garland, Gaslight, starring Ingrid Bergman in her Oscar-winning role, and National Velvet, starring Mickey Rooney and a young Elizabeth Taylor. Side note, if you haven't watched Gaslight, it's a really interesting film. The term gaslighting that many people use today can be traced back to the play that this movie is based on, so check it out when you get a chance. By the time the studio reached its 25th anniversary in 1949, most of the biggest stars were at MGM.
MGM really was the most powerful studio of all, not only in drama pictures, but in musicals. And they had a stock family, Mr. Mayer called us his family, like no other family in the world.
Mr. Clark Gable. Miss Ava Gardner. Miss Judy Garland. Mr. Fred Astaire. Miss Greer Garson, ladies and gentlemen. Miss Katharine Hepburn. Miss Lena Horne.
However, shortly thereafter, there were signs of trouble as consumers started to favor TV in the late 1940s, which resulted in dwindling profits for the studio. Mayer continued to try and lower expenses, but being unsuccessful, Mayer was fired by the East Coast executives in August 1951. With Mayer gone, MGM was still producing profitable musicals for the studio, including An American in Paris in 1951, Singin' in the Rain in 1952, and Seven Brides for Seven Brothers in 1954. However, other musicals such as Deep in My Heart and Brigadoon, both in 1954, lost money. MGM tried to diversify and made its first foray into the production of television programming with the MGM Parade in 1956, but it was quickly canceled by ABC. For the first time in history, MGM lost money in 1957, ironically the same year that Mayer died. The last great film MGM made during its golden era was Ben-Hur, which was a remake of its 1925 silent film, this time starring Charlton Heston in 1959. The film would earn 11 Academy Awards, including Best Picture. This record would stand until Titanic matched it in 1997, and Lord of the Rings: The Return of the King again matched it in 2003. However, 1959 also saw the crumbling of the studio system, including the divesting of the Lowe's movie chain, changing consumer preferences, and more unpredictable production costs. By 1960, MGM had released all of its remaining contract players, and the studio system in MGM's golden age was effectively over. In the 1960s, the studio was in bad shape. It became a prime target for corporate takeover, as the assets of the company were valued higher than the stock itself. At this point, the direction and ownership of MGM gets a bit chaotic and changes hands several times between investors, creditors, and corporate raiders, so I'll try to just hit the highlights here. The first takeover occurred in 1966 when MGM was sold to a Canadian investor, who then sold the company a few years later due to the company's lack of profitability. In 1969, Kurt Kerkorian saw an opportunity and bought 40% of MGM. He brought in new management, many of whom had no idea what they were doing. The purchase by Kerkorian would usher in an era for MGM of being constantly bought and sold. Kerkorian himself bought and sold the company 3 times. He followed a pattern used by many corporate vultures. He would lever up the company, so take out a bunch of debt to buy the company, and then begin the process of sell-offs, divestitures, and laying off staff, instead of actually making and distributing movies. He also started focusing on other ventures with the MGM name, including the MGM Resort International, a Las Vegas-based hotel and casino. By 1973, the studio had stopped film distribution entirely. Remember when I talked about MGM being like its own city? Well, most of that was sold off to service all the debt that was incurred. MGM had to sell off its Culver City studio complex, 40 acres of backlots, film libraries, subsidiaries, and classic memorabilia. Some of the memorabilia sold even included Dorothy's ruby slippers that Judy Garland wore in The Wizard of Oz. Kerkorian focused on the MGM Grand Hotel portion of the business and less on the studio. In fact, in 1979, Kerkorian said that MGM was primarily a hotel company. The filmmaking part of the business was largely ignored and was quickly losing money. David Begelman would come to MGM as president and CEO in 1980. He was hired after he had been discovered for forgery and embezzlement when he was head of the studio over at Columbia Pictures. Prior to leading studios, he was an agent and he embezzled money from his clients then too. He wouldn't have been my first choice, but nobody asked me. Also in 1980, MGM tried to get back in the game and bought United Artists in an effort to increase output and increase its film library. But the effort didn't really make a difference. During Begelman's 2 years at the company, he only had one hit with The Poltergeist in 1982. The company was going down fast, and the studio began picking up independent productions instead of financing its own projects as it once had. Kerkorian tried to expand his control and buy the rest of the shares of the company, but was met with resistance from other shareholders. In 1986, Kerkorian sold MGM to Ted Turner, bought it back, and then sold it again in 1992, only to buy it back in 1996. See what I mean about getting chaotic? Once the dust settled on the transactions, Turner kept the pre-May 1986 film library, RKO library, and pre-1950 Warner Brothers films that United Artists had previously purchased. He would use this catalog when he developed his cable channel, Turner Classic Movies. In 2002, Kerkorian put MGM up for sale again, hoping to get a price of about $7 billion. In 2004, MGM was sold to a consortium including Sony Pictures, Comcast, and TPG Capital for about $5 billion. However, this only exacerbated the debt situation, and MGM was about $3.7 billion in debt by mid-2009. Interest payments alone totaled $250 million annually, and MGM was only earning $500 million a year from its film and TV libraries. Because of the massive debt load, MGM was forced to file Chapter 11 bankruptcy in 2010. MGM emerged from bankruptcy later in 2010, now owned by its creditors and looking for ways to sell the company. Fast forward to May 26, 2021, when Amazon announced its intentions to buy the studio for $8.45 billion. Due to all of the buying and selling of MGM and its various film catalogs, Amazon will not be buying classic films made by MGM such as Wizard of Oz and Singin' in the Rain. What they are buying is what MGM produces today, which includes Rocky, Creed, James Bond franchises, as well as The Handmaid's Tale under MGM Television. The deal is still subject to regulator approval, but at this point I don't think regulators actually care about things like antitrust laws anymore. So with that, it's looking like Jeff Bezos will be the new MGM lion for the next chapter of the studio story. I guess we'll have to stay tuned to see what comes next. Thank you so much for watching. Please remember to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Let me know what you think, and I'll see you next time.